Okay, so imagine, just for a second, the incredibly harsh reality of the early Canadian frontier. We are talking about completely isolated, freezing trading posts, wildly vulnerable to the elements, and anchored almost entirely by the foundational fur trade. To go from that, literally a massive, spread-out collection of fragile colonies, to a highly developed, independent, constitutional nation, it is an absolutely incredible story of survival and transformation. So today, in this explainer, we're going to trace that exact macro-level journey to uncover exactly how the modern Canadian identity was forged. To really get a grasp on the Canadian identity today, we're going to walk through 5 defining historical crucibles. We'll be looking at forging the Confederation, Vimy Ridge, surviving the Dirty Thirties, Quebec's Quiet Revolution, and finally, the 1982 Charter of Rights. Here is a quick bird's-eye view of our timeline. Our journey spans from the foundational 1867 Union through a pretty brutal, transformative century of military, economic, and social trials. As you'll see, each crisis basically layered upon the last, ultimately culminating in the 1982 Constitution. Let's dive into our first crucible, forging the Canadian Confederation in 1867. This was the moment the province of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick united into the Dominion of Canada. Now, the model they chose for this new dominion was peace, order, and good government. Sounds a bit dry, right? But honestly, this wasn't just some catchy political phrase. It was quite literally a desperate survival strategy. Think about it. At the time, the United States had just emerged from its Civil War with a massive, battle-tested military. There was a very real fear of American manifest destiny just swallowing these northern colonies whole. So, facing the loss of U.S. trade markets and looming military pressure, these colonies practically had to band together. They integrated their economies, financed vital infrastructure like the intercolonial railway, and built a unified defense. But, and this is absolutely crucial to understand, while Confederation achieved a really necessary pragmatic union for the settlers, it came with a massive, devastating blind spot. The process completely ignored the Indigenous communities who had, lived on the land for millennia. Instead of building nation-to-nation partnerships, Confederation entrenched harsh conditions of colonialism. It replaced Indigenous self-governance with resource grabbing, broken treaties, and eventually the 1876 Indian Act. This legally enforced assimilation and set up generational traumas that the country is very much still grappling with today. Jump forward exactly 50 years to 1917, and we hit crucible number 2, Vimy Ridge, a nation born. During the unprecedented slaughter of World War I, this young nation faced its first massive international test. Brigadier General A.E. Ross famously said of that battle, "In those few minutes, I witnessed the birth of a nation." And the reason Vimy holds such mythic status in Canada isn't just the victory itself, it's how they pulled it off. For the very first time, all 4 Canadian divisions fought together. Men from Nova Scotia to British Columbia attacked as a single unified force, using incredibly precise, innovative tactics like the creeping artillery barrage. This one singular moment shifted Canada's identity completely out from under the shadow of the British Empire. They proved to the world and to themselves that they were capable of coordinated greatness. However, we have to acknowledge that this newfound national identity was forged at a terrible, tragic cost, 11,285. That is the staggering number of Canadian soldiers killed in France who have absolutely no known graves. It's a profoundly sobering reminder of the sheer amount of blood spilled to earn that independent global standing. So, just over a decade later, the resilience of this young, war-tested nation gets challenged all over again. When the global economy completely crashed in 1929, it left everyone grappling with a huge question. How does a nation rebuild its identity when the economic floor basically just falls out from under it? Which brings us to our third crucible, surviving the Dirty Thirties. The Great Depression was global, obviously, but it hit Canada with uniquely brutal, compounding force. To really get why the Dirty Thirties were so devastating there, you have to look at their economy at the time. Canada was heavily reliant on exporting raw materials, timber, minerals, and wheat. When global trade halted, their economy literally froze. Now combine that economic freeze with a crippling multi-year drought in the prairies known as the Dust Bowl. Millions of Canadians were suddenly unemployed, hungry, and homeless. And this widespread shared trauma completely shifted the public psychology.
It triggered new populist political movements and a desperate, urgent demand for social safety nets.
The sheer scale of the suffering was so immense that the government actually had to abandon its traditional hands-off approach. This gave birth to what we call the activist state. The federal government realized, okay, we have to intervene to save the country. So they nationalized the Bank of Canada to manage the financial system. They also created the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC. And this wasn't just for entertainment. It was a deliberate move to prevent powerful American radio signals from totally dominating Canadian culture, actively stitching this vast, spread-out population together over the airwaves. While the federal government was rapidly expanding its role, the 1960s brought a profound sociocultural transformation at the provincial level. Crucible number 4, Quebec's Quiet Revolution. The contrast here is just staggering. Pre-1960s Quebec was a highly traditional society where the Catholic Church deeply controlled daily life, holding the reins on education and healthcare. But following the 1960 election, the province underwent the Quiet Revolution, and it was rapid. Almost overnight, Quebec transformed into a highly secularized, modern society with the provincial government aggressively taking control of its own institutions. A huge cornerstone of this era was the État-providence, basically a state-administrated welfare system. By wresting control of hospitals and schools away from the church, Quebec ushered in massive modernization. But here's the catch. Building this powerful provincial state also fueled a new, highly assertive Quebecois nationalism. It was a deep ideological shift that would end up challenging federal politics and sparking independence referendums for decades. So, all of these historical crucibles, the pragmatic colonial union, the horrific wartime sacrifices, the massive expansion of the federal government, and the social revolution in Quebec, they all culminate in our final milestone, the 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Constitution Act of 1982 was monumental because it finally patriated the Constitution. In plain English, that meant Canada brought its ultimate legal authority home from Britain, gaining total, independent control over its own constitutional laws. It established a permanent, written framework for civil liberties, opening with the preamble, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Section 2 of the Charter explicitly lays out fundamental freedoms for everyone: freedom of religion, expression, peaceful assembly. This sets the absolute baseline for an open and democratic society. It is the bedrock law that guarantees your right to speak your mind, practice your faith, or gather in protest today without government interference. And building directly on that economic and geographic integration that started with the railways way back in 1867, the Charter also strictly locks in democratic rules and mobility. It ensures governments must face elections at least every 5 years, and it legally protects the right of citizens to travel, live, and work across any provincial border. Now, because the Canadian government had evolved into that incredibly powerful activist state we saw during the 1930s, the Charter also needed to establish robust legal rights to protect the individual from potential state overreach. It guarantees that the government cannot arbitrarily deprive anyone of life, liberty, or security except in strict accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. And here is where history finally begins to circle back to correct itself. Remember that massive blind spot of Indigenous exclusion during the 1867 Confederation? Well, importantly, Section 25 ensures that the new rights granted in the Charter do not take away from any Aboriginal, treaty, or other rights. This marked a really critical formal constitutional shift to finally recognize and legally protect the Indigenous peoples who'd been pushed aside for over a century. You know, the Canadian Constitution is famously interpreted as a living tree, something deeply rooted in history, but definitely capable of growing and adapting to new realities. So, as we look back at the incredible trials that forged this country, from fragile colonies through global war, crippling depression, and profound social upheaval, it leaves us with one pretty compelling question. How will this living, breathing identity adapt to the challenges of tomorrow?